The sky broke open on a Tuesday. Nobody remembered it as a Tuesday afterward. They remembered it as the day the light changed. That flat, pewter quality that settled over every city on Earth at roughly the same moment, as though someone had stretched a gray film across the sun. In Long Island, a woman named Anisha Malik noticed it first from her kitchen window. She was washing a coffee mug, and the light just went wrong in a way she couldn't name. The way a note played slightly off-key is still recognizable as a note, but makes your teeth ache. She stood there with the mug in both hands and looked at the sky for a long moment before her son Luke appeared at the kitchen doorway asking, "What was for breakfast?" She told him eggs. She did not tell him that her hands were shaking. In Kandahar, Sergeant First Class Trevante Cole was doing push-ups in the pre-dawn dark outside his bunk when the ground moved. Not an earthquake, he'd felt earthquakes, and this was slower, more deliberate, like something large passing beneath the earth, the way a submarine passes beneath a boat. He stopped, hands flat against the dirt, and felt it twice more, 3 pulses, then nothing. He stood up, brushed the grit from his palms, and looked at the sky. It was not yet light. The stars above the Afghan mountains were still visible, but something about their arrangement felt wrong to him, though he could not have said why. He was not a man given to superstition. He filed the feeling away and went inside for coffee. He would think about that filing away later. He would think about how much of the first hours were spent filing things away. In Tokyo, Mitsuki Yamato was at her workstation at the JAXA Communications Center when every instrument on her board went dead simultaneously. Not a glitch, not a power surge. Every screen, every readout, every signal feed, blank. She sat very still for a moment, then said quietly, a single word in Japanese that roughly translated to, "Not possible." Then she stood and began working the problem, the way she had been trained to do, the way she could not stop herself from doing even when the problem was not possible. The Hoshi 12 satellite, which she had spent 3 years of her life helping design and launch, had gone silent. It was not in a known debris field. It had not reported any system failures. It was simply gone from every frequency, all at once, as though something had put a hand over its mouth. She did not file this away. She began making calls. In rural England, a boy named Caspar Morrow sat in the back of a school bus with his earphones and noticed that the sheep in the fields they were passing had all stopped moving. Every single one. Hundreds of sheep, standing perfectly still with their heads raised, all facing the same direction. He pulled one earphone out. The bus driver, Mr. Devaney, hadn't noticed. The other kids hadn't noticed. Caspar pressed his face against the glass and watched the frozen animals until the road curved and took them from his sight. He put his earphone back in. He did not tell anyone. He was 13 years old and had learned the hard way that telling people things they weren't ready to hear only made things harder for yourself. He stared at the seat back in front of him and felt, deep behind his eyes, the beginning of a headache that would not leave him for weeks. The first confirmed impact was in the Pacific, 400 miles southwest of Hawaii, at 11:47 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. A Navy destroyer, the USS Carrington, was the first ship to reach the coordinates. What they found was a debris field roughly 2 kilometers across, and at its center, something that was not debris. The crew of the Carrington sent one transmission back to Pearl Harbor. The transmission was 3 words long. Then the Carrington went silent. The 3 words were, "It's still moving." Within 6 hours, similar events were being reported on every inhabited continent. They were not all the same. Some were impacts, things falling from the sky, tearing craters in cornfields and mountain slopes, and in 2 cases, city centers. Some were more subtle, a communications dead zone expanding outward from the Sahara like a spreading bruise, a section of ocean near the Maldives that turned opaque and still, an entire town in rural Saskatchewan where every dog went mad simultaneously and then just as suddenly lay down and slept. In Washington, the Joint Chiefs gathered. In Beijing, the Politburo convened. In Moscow, certain phones rang. In Brussels and Riyadh and Delhi, men and women who had spent careers preparing for every conceivable threat to their nations found that their preparations covered nothing that was currently happening, and they sat in rooms with very thick walls and talked in low, careful voices about things they did not yet have words for. The President of the United States, watching a feed from a reconnaissance drone over the Kandahar site, said something that her press secretary later confirmed had never, in 40 years of public life, passed her lips before. The world did not end that day, but it changed its shape, quietly, the way a river changes its bed. Not all at once, but so thoroughly that when you look back from downstream, the old course seems impossible, seems like something that was never real. Anisha Malik had been a doctor once. Not a practicing doctor anymore. She had given that up for her family, for Ahmed, for the suburb and the school district, and the life that had seemed at the time like a fair trade. But the training didn't leave you. The habit of observation, the refusal to accept mystery when examination was possible, the understanding that things which looked heritable from a distance sometimes became manageable when you got close enough to see what was actually happening. These things didn't leave you. She would need them. The first 2 days, she kept the children home from school. The news was fragmented and contradictory. Crater impacts here, power grid failures there, ships going silent. Ahmed watched the coverage obsessively, cycling between channels, his jaw tight. He was a software engineer. He worked in abstractions, in systems he could model and predict. He had no framework for this. The children sensed his tension, and it made them brittle and loud, and the house felt smaller by the hour. On the third day, the crater appeared in the nature preserve 6 miles north of their town. Anisha found out about it the same way the rest of Long Island found out about it, the sound. A low, thrumming vibration that wasn't quite a sound, more of a pressure in the teeth and the jaw that woke her at 3 a.m. and lasted for 40 minutes and then stopped. By morning, there were military vehicles on the highway. By afternoon, the National Guard had set up a perimeter checkpoint 3 miles from their neighborhood. By evening, the power grid flickered, stabilized, flickered again, and then went out entirely. They lit candles. Anisha found the camping lanterns in the garage. Luke, 11 years old and trying so hard to seem like it wasn't affecting him, sat at the kitchen table with a book he wasn't reading. Sarah, 8, sat in Anisha's lap and didn't say much. Ahmed made calls on his cell phone that increasingly went to voicemail, and each failed call made the muscles in his jaw jump a little harder. He left that night. Not permanently. He said it wasn't permanently. He said he needed to go check on his families in the city, his sister, his parents. He said he'd be back by morning. He packed a bag that was slightly too large for an overnight trip. He kissed the children. He kissed Anisha on the forehead, not the mouth. He left. She stood at the window and watched his car until the taillights disappeared, and then she stood there for a moment longer looking at the dark road. And she did what she had always done when faced with something she could not process. She made a list, not on paper, in her head, what they had, what they needed, what the next 24 hours required. Food, 6 days if she was careful. Water, the taps still worked. Medication. Sarah had a mild asthma inhaler. Luke had nothing special. Money. The ATMs were down everywhere, but she had $300 in the emergency envelope in the back of the kitchen drawer. Shelter. They had shelter. They had a house and a car and a full tank of gas, and they had these things because she had made it a habit to never let the tank drop below half because you never knew. She had always made that habit and had always privately thought it was an overreaction. She did not think that anymore. In the morning, she loaded the car. Travante Cole had been in worse situations than this. That was the thing he kept telling himself on the second day, crouched in the ruins of what had been a forward operating base in Kandahar province, listening to something move in the darkness outside the crumbled walls. He had been in Fallujah. He had been in the Korangal Valley. He had been in a 5-vehicle convoy when the lead truck hit an IED, and he'd had to carry a man with no left leg for 4 kilometers through sniper country. He had been in worse situations, but in those situations, he had known what was shooting at him. The fob had been hit the previous night, not by anything his training had names for. There had been no warning, no incoming fire in the conventional sense. There had been a sound subsonic that everyone in the base had felt in their sternums rather than heard with their ears. And then the north wall had simply ceased to exist, replaced by a crater 12 meters across, and 7 of the 14 people in the base at that moment had been in the north half of the compound. Travante had been in the south half, in the latrine, of all the ignominious places to survive anything. He had come out of the latrine into a cloud of dust and silence, and he had found 3 other survivors, PFC Dominguez, Sergeant Pierce, and Staff Sergeant Ana Varas, and they had gathered what weapons and supplies they could, and they had moved. They moved for 3 days. What was hunting them? And it was hunting them. He was certain of this by the end of the first day. Left tracks that Travante had never seen before, and could not identify. Long, 3-pronged impressions in the dust, widely spaced, suggesting something that moved on legs that were too far apart for any animal he knew. The tracks appeared and disappeared without logic, as though the thing could stop moving and start again in a different spot. It circled them at night. It never attacked directly. It was learning something, he thought. It was studying them. On the third morning, Pierce was gone. His sleeping bag was still there. His boots were still there. He was not there. Vara said, "We need to move faster." Travante said, "We've been moving fast." Dominguez said nothing. He was 22 years old from Albuquerque, New Mexico. and he had a picture of his mother tucked into his helmet band. The soldiers in old wars used to carry pictures in their hat bands, and Trevante caught him looking at the picture that morning for a long time before he put his helmet on. They found a working radio in an abandoned Afghan National Police vehicle outside a village that had been evacuated by its inhabitants or by something else Trevante could not tell. He got a signal. He reported their position. He was told to hold in place, that extraction was being arranged. He was told that what was happening in Kandahar was also happening in 17 other locations worldwide, that the military response was being coordinated, that they should stay armed and stay together and wait, he said. Understood. He did not stay in place. He had survived this long by moving, and the thing that had taken Pierce had found them while they were stationary. He moved. He was moving toward London when he found the bus. The school bus had been on the road between Cardiff and London when the highway became impassable. 42 students from a secondary school in Cardiff, 2 teachers and a driver, stranded on the M4 when the cars in front of them simply stopped, drivers getting out, some running, the highway becoming a parking lot, and then becoming a graveyard of vehicles. The teachers had made the decision to get the students off the road and into the trees. That had been 4 days ago. Now they were in a farmhouse in the Cotswolds, and there were 39 of them left. Caspar Morrow was not the biggest or the strongest or the most popular. He was a quiet boy with dark circles under his eyes who had been on that bus because his school had an exchange program with the Cardiff school, and he'd been the only one from his class who applied for it. He'd applied because his mother had suggested it, and his mother was very ill, and he had wanted to make her happy. He did not think about his mother very much anymore, because when he thought about her, he stopped being able to function, and functioning was currently the most important thing. What Caspar had, which nobody else seemed to have, was an ability to sense where the alien presences were before anyone could see them. He didn't understand it. It had started as the headache, that pressure behind his eyes that had begun on the bus watching the frozen sheep. Over the 4 days in the farmhouse, the headache had refined itself into something more specific, a directional awareness, like a compass needle that twitched toward danger. The first time he'd warned the group, telling them to get away from the eastern windows, just before something moved past the farm in that direction, they hadn't listened. The second time they had. By the 4th day, they listened to him without question, though he could see it frightened them. It frightened him too. Jamila Huston was the one who took him seriously from the beginning. She was 15, a year older than Caspar, and she was from London, and she had a quality Caspar recognized because he had it too. The quality of someone who had learned to notice things. She noticed things about people, about situations, about the geometry of danger. She kept a small notebook where she wrote down everything she observed. She showed it to Caspar on the 2nd day. Neat, small handwriting. Lists of observations about the alien movements, the times and directions, what seemed to trigger them and what seemed to let them pass. She said, "You feel them before they come. I can see it in your face." He said, "Yeah." She said, "How far out do you feel them?" He thought about it. "A kilometer? Maybe. Sometimes more." She wrote that down. She said, "We need to get to London," Caspar said. "I know." She said, "Can you get us there?" He looked at the 39 people in the farmhouse, most of them younger than him, some of them crying, the 2 teachers doing their best and failing in the way that adults failed when the situation outran everything they'd been prepared for. He looked at Jamila, who was not failing. He said, "Yeah, they started the next morning. Mitsuki Yamato had not slept in 4 days. This was not unusual for her in a crisis, but most crises did not involve the systematic dissolution of everything she had built her career on. The Hoshi 12 was gone. The deep space communication array at the facility had been repurposed by the Defense Ministry for military coordination, which meant her work, the work she had spent 3 years on, the work that had cost her a relationship and most of her social life and a borderline, dangerous relationship with coffee, was suspended indefinitely. She was no longer at her own workstation. She was in a requisitioned communications van in a parking structure in Osaka, running patch cable connections between borrowed equipment and arguing with military communications offers about bandwidth allocation. Her colleague Kaito Kawaguchi had died on the 2nd day. Not killed, died. He had been trying to reach his family in the city when a panic crush at a transit station had caught him and he had fallen, and in the chaos, no one had helped him up in time. She had learned about it from a text message from his sister, and she had sat with that information for exactly 4 minutes before going back to work, because going back to work was the only thing she could do with it. She was not grieving. She was not grieving either. She had simply put the grief in a room and closed the door and told herself she would open that door when the work was done. She was not sure she believed that, but she believed in the work. What she had found, buried in the last transmission data from HFY 12 before it went silent, was a pattern, not a random failure, not environmental interference, a sequence, a specific non-random interference pattern that repeated at precise intervals in the 47 seconds before the satellite's signal cut out. She had isolated it. She had run it through every decryption and signal analysis tool she had access to. It was not a human signal. It was not natural. It was structured, which meant it was intentional, which meant something was communicating, or had been communicating, at a frequency human technology had not previously detected. She was working on the assumption that understanding the signal was the most important thing she could do. A defense ministry colonel came to her van twice a day to ask her what she had found. She told him what she had found. He looked at the data, which he could not interpret, and asked her when she would have something actionable. She said, "I don't know." He said, "That's not acceptable." She said, "Then find someone else." He went away and came back the next day, and she was still there working, and he stopped asking for timelines. On the 6th day, she played the signal backward. It was not a code. It was not a language, exactly. It was something more like music, a structure that carried meaning not in discrete symbols, but in relationships, intervals, the space between sounds as much as the sounds themselves. She sat with her headphones on in the van and listened to it for 3 hours. And at the end of 3 hours, she understood something she had not understood before, and what she understood frightened her. More than any of the physical destruction she had seen on the news feeds. They had been studying Earth's communications for a long time before they came. They had been listening. Not just listening, learning. They had been cataloging, organizing. What Mitsuki was hearing in the reverse signal was a vast, patient process of indexings. Languages, frequencies, patterns of human communication, all of it absorbed and stored, the way you might learn a foreign language before visiting a foreign country. The signal was not a greeting or a declaration. It was a study session, and the fact that HFY 12 had intercepted it suggested the study session had been intended to be invisible. It had only become visible because the satellite's very specific orbital geometry had put it in exactly the right position at exactly the right moment, and because Mitsuki had been paying very close attention. She took her headphones off. She looked at the data for a long time. Then she said, very quietly, in English, which was her second language, "We are not as unknown to them as they were to us." She picked up the headphones. She began building a response. The refugee convoy that Anisha Malik joined on the road north of White Plains was not a military convoy. It was a civilian convoy. 40 vehicles, maybe 80 people, organized by a man named Randall, who had managed a hardware distribution center and, consequently, had extensive experience in logistics and absolutely no experience with anything else. He had a truck with a roof rack full of water, which was why people followed him. He was not a bad man. He was a man with a narrow set of skills, operating far outside his narrow set of skills, and he did not know it. Anisha knew it within 2 hours of joining the convoy. She stayed quiet about it. She was a woman, she was South Asian, and she was dealing with a group of 40-odd strangers who were frightened and who had coalesced around Randall specifically because he projected a confident authority that made people feel less frightened. Undermining that authority without anything immediately better to replace it would make things worse. She watched and she listened, and she kept Luke and Sarah close, and she waited. The situation that required her to stop waiting happened on the 3rd day of the convoy. A woman named Greta developed a fever of 104. Greta had 2 children of her own, and her husband had not made it out of their town when the impact started, and she had been pushing through the grief and the fear and the continuous exertion of moving, and it had caught up with her immune system. The fever was not alien in origin. It was pneumonia, plain and simple, probably bacterial, possibly viral, the kind of thing that killed people routinely in the pre-antibiotic era and still killed people in the modern era when treatment was unavailable. Randall's response was to suggest leaving Greta and her children at the next farmhouse they passed. Anisha said no. She said it quietly, but she said it in the tone she had once used in emergency rooms to stop panicking residents from making bad decisions under pressure, the tone that was not loud but was entirely without doubt. Randall looked at her. She met his eyes. She said, "I'm a doctor," she said. "The fever is bacterial pneumonia." She said, "I need to find a pharmacy and I can treat it," she said. "If we leave her here, she dies in 3 days and her children are alone, and we will all have done that." Randall said, "We can't stop," she said. "I'm not asking you to stop. I'm asking you to detour." 10 minutes. It was not 10 minutes. It was 45 minutes because the first pharmacy they found had been emptied, and the second had no antibiotics left, and the third, a small independent drugstore in a town called Millbrook that Anisha knew from medical training had served a lot of elderly patients, and therefore always stocked broad-spectrum antibiotics, was intact. She went in alone while Randall kept the convoy running. She came out with what she needed. She started Greta on amoxicillin that evening. Greta was walking on her own by the next morning. After that, Randall stopped making decisions without consulting Anisha first. It was not formally acknowledged. Nothing was said. It was simply the case that Anisha knew things he didn't know, and he was smart enough to recognize that this made her more useful as a partner than as a passenger. The convoy moved north. They did not know and would not know for another week that what they were moving toward was not safety. There was no safety to move toward. What the military was not yet saying on the emergency broadcast frequencies, what the government was not yet admitting to the civilian population, was that the impacts had not been random. They had been mapped. Carefully, methodically mapped. The craters formed a pattern that military analysts had identified but were not yet ready to publish. A ring around every major population center in the northern hemisphere, spaced at precise intervals, forming a perimeter. They were not destroying cities. They were surrounding them. What was inside the ring was not safer than what was outside it. What was inside the ring was being studied. Trevante Cole arrived in London on foot, having covered the last 40 kilometers after his commandeered vehicle ran out of fuel on the M20. He was carrying a rifle he'd taken from a dead soldier in a village outside Canterbury, a pack that held food for 2 days and water for 3, and a burn on his left forearm from an encounter in the Channel Tunnel that he did not think about because thinking about it did not help anything. He was in London because of a radio intercept. In the debris field outside Kandahar, in the wreckage of a Taliban communications post that had been caught in the same strike that had flattened the fob, he had found a functioning satellite phone and had used it to make contact with a signals intelligence unit that was trying to coordinate survivor information. The unit had a record of a school group from Cardiff stranded on the M4, last known position somewhere in the Cotswolds. One of the students had a profile in a government database, a minor flag, nothing serious, relating to some anomalous results in a standard school medical screening. And the unit had been tasked with finding that student and bringing them to a research facility in London. The student's name was Casper Morrow. Trevante had no particular reason to take this detour. He had a wife back in Virginia. He had a life back in Virginia, or the ruins of a life, which he was aware he had been systematically dismantling for 3 years by being somewhere other than Virginia whenever the opportunity arose. He had been planning to go home. He had the satellite phone. He had called Lyra. She had answered, which was more than he'd expected, and her voice had been the specific kind of flat and careful that meant she was furious, but was currently more frightened than she was furious, and she had said, "Come home, Trevante." He had said, "I will." He had said, "I just have to do one thing first." He always had one thing to do first. He found them outside of Oxford, 31 of the original 39 students, and one of the 2 teachers, moving along the canal path in the gray English morning. Casper Morrow was at the front. Trevante recognized him by the way he moved. Head up, alert, doing something with his attention that Trevante recognized from long patrols in hostile country, that specific quality of extended awareness that took years of combat training to develop, and which this 13-year-old child had apparently developed by accident or by whatever biological mystery had flagged his medical records. He hailed them from across the field. The group went very still. Casper turned and looked at him for a long moment. Then he said to the girl beside him, Jamila. As Trevante later learned, "He's okay." And Jamila said, "How do you know?" And Casper said, "I don't. But he's like me." Trevante crossed the field. He stood in front of Casper and they looked at each other. Trevante was a large, serious man with a burned forearm and 3 days of beard and a rifle over his shoulder. Casper was a pale, slight boy with bruises under his eyes and a blue windbreaker that had grass stains on the elbows. Trevante said, "I've been looking for you." Casper said, "I know." Trevante said, "You know?" Casper touched his temple. He said, "I knew someone was looking about 2 days ago. I didn't know it was you specifically." Trevante looked at him for another moment. He said, "All right, let's get to London," Casper said. "There's something between us and London. It moves through that area at night. If we time it right, we can get through in the late afternoon before it circles back." Trevante said, "You're sure?" Casper said, "Pretty sure." Trevante said, "Pretty sure," Casper said. About 90% sure, Trevante thought about this. He had made his career on much worse odds. He said, "All right, late afternoon." They sat down in the hedgerow and they waited, and while they waited, Casper told Travante everything he knew, and Travante listened in the way he had trained himself to listen to intelligence reports, without filtering for plausibility, taking all of it in first and evaluating later, and what he concluded, sitting in that English hedgerow with the gray sky above him and 31, scared children arranged along the canal path like a fragile thread, was that this boy was possibly the most important person he had ever met. He did not say this. He said, okay, get some rest. We move at 3. The facility in London was a converted research annex of University College, hospital, taken over by a joint civilian-military task force that had been quietly assembled in the first 72 hours, and that operated under a mandate so classified that most of the people in it did not know the full scope of what they were doing. What they were doing, in aggregate, was trying to understand, not to fight, not yet, to understand. The people gathered there included neurologists and quantum physicists and xenobiologists and linguists and military intelligence analysts, and 2 people from GHQ who would not say which division they were from. It also included, by the time Travante arrived with Caspar and the remnants of the school group, a Japanese communications engineer named Mitsuki Yamato, who had been evacuated from Osaka on a military transport after the defense ministry, concluded that what she had found in the Hoshi 12 data was sufficiently significant to justify the risk of moving her. She arrived the day before Travante. She set up her equipment in a corner of the research annex and resumed working without acknowledging anyone. The U staff found this rude. Travante, who arrived the next day, found it familiar. He recognized it as the focus of someone who had decided that the work was more important than comfort, including their own. He had made that decision himself many times. The difference was that when he made it, the work was usually destruction. When Mitsuki made it, the work was understanding. He thought about the difference. He thought it probably mattered enormously, though he wasn't sure how yet. Casper and Jamila were given a room of their own in the annex. The rest of the school group was settled in a dormitory in the basement. Travante sat outside their door for the first night, not assigned to do so, just doing it, because the pattern he had observed over 3 weeks of surviving alien territory had taught him something about the value of an early warning system, and Casper was currently the most reliable early warning system on the planet. On the first night, Casper knocked on the door from inside and said, "You can come in, you know." Travante came in. Casper was sitting cross-legged on his cot. Jamila was in the other cot, asleep. Travante sat in the chair by the window and they looked at each other in the dark for a moment. Casper said, "How many people did you lose?" Travante thought about Dominguez, who had made it. He thought about Pierce, who hadn't. He thought about the 7 people in the north half of the Kandahar compound. He said, "A few." Casper said, "I've been thinking about how they move." Travante said, "Tell me." Casper said, "They don't move the way we move. We move toward things. We have a destination and we go to it. They move outward, like they're broadcasting, like they're trying to fill space rather than cross it." He paused. He said, "The headache is worst when they're changing direction, when they're turning, like a car engine revving up." Travante said, "So you get warning when they change course?" Casper said, "Yeah." Travante said, "How much warning?" Casper said, "Depends on how far they are. Close. Maybe 30 seconds. Far. A few minutes." Travante was quiet for a moment. He was doing math in his head, the way he always did math in his head. Not arithmetic, but tactical calculus. The arithmetic of survival, where the variables were time and distance and threat, and the equation, if you solved it correctly, kept you alive. He said, "That's enough." Casper said, "Enough for what?" Travante said, "To not just be hiding from them." Casper looked at him. He said, "You want to fight them?" Travante said, "I want to understand how to fight them." "It's not the same thing," Casper said. "Everyone wants to fight them." Travante said, "Most people who want to fight them haven't fought anything before. They want to fight them in the abstract. I want to fight them in the specific. There's a difference." Casper was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My mum is sick. She was sick before all this. She's in a hospital in London. I don't know if the hospital is still." He stopped. Travante waited. Casper said, "I don't know if she's still there." Travante said, "When we have a minute, I'll find out." Casper said, "You don't have to do that," Travante said. "I know." They sat with that for a while. Outside the window, London was dark and mostly quiet, the alien ring around it like a held breath. It was Mitsuki who found the frequency. She had been working on the response signal for 9 days. Not building a translation, she was not trying to speak to them. Not yet. What she was building was a disruptor, something much smaller and more specific. She had noticed, buried in the study session signal from Hoshi 12, something that had taken her days to isolate. The signal had a tolerance threshold, a point at which If a certain frequency was introduced at a specific resonant magnitude, it degraded. Not catastrophically, it wasn't a kill switch, but measurably, meaningfully, like throwing a handful of sand into a very precise machine. If the aliens navigated and sensed using this signal, and she believed they did, based on the movement patterns the task force had been aggregating from reports across the globe, then disrupting the signal would disrupt their navigation, their awareness, briefly, maybe for 30 seconds, maybe for a minute. She presented this to the task force on day 9. The response was a room full of people talking over each other, which she had expected. The military contingent wanted to know if it could be weaponized at scale. The scientists wanted more data. The intelligence analysts wanted to know how she had concluded what she had concluded. She answered the scientists and the intelligence analysts and told the military contingent, it's not a weapon, it's interference. The difference matters. A man from the American contingent, a general or something adjacent to a general, who had arrived 3 days earlier and had not told anyone his actual rank or same, which Travante had silently noted and filed, said, "Can you make it portable," she said, "with the right components?" She listed the components. 2 of them were not currently available in London. One of them she was not sure was available anywhere in England. Travant said, "Tell me what you need." He went out the next day with a list and a set of instructions he had memorized, because a written list was a liability. He took Dominguez, who had arrived with a group of survivors from Canterbury the previous week. They were gone for 14 hours. They came back with 11 of the 12 items on the list. The 12th, a specific type of oscillator component, Travante described in detail to an electrical engineer named Priya, who was part of the task force, and Priya said, "I can build that. Give me 6 hours." Priya built it in 4. Mitsuki took the components and assembled the device without speaking to anyone for 16 straight hours. Travant brought her coffee twice. She did not acknowledge the coffee, but she drank both cups. When she emerged from her corner with the device, it was smaller than anyone had expected, about the size of a hardback book, matte black, with a single control interface and an output port. She said, "This will disrupt their sensory navigation within approximately a 40-meter radius for between 30 seconds and 90 seconds. I can't be more precise than that because I don't have test data." She looked around the room. She said, "Someone has to carry it close enough to use it." Everyone looked at Travante. He looked at the device. He looked at Mitsuki. He said, "Is it going to hurt me?" She said, "It will give you a significant headache." He said, "Can you make it directional so it hits them and not me?" She said, "Partially." She modified the output port with a directional baffler she fabricated from components she had on her workbench. She handed it back to him. She said, 60% directional. You'll still feel it." He said, "I've had worse headaches." Casper, from his seat in the corner of the room. He was always in the corner, Travante had noticed. Always with his back to the wall. A habit Travante recognized with something like kinship. Said, "You're not going alone." Travante said, "Yes, I am," Casper said. "You need someone who can tell you how far out they are. 30 seconds isn't enough. You need the earlier warning." Travante looked at him for a long time. He thought about Casper's mother in a hospital somewhere in London, who may or may not still be there. He thought about the fact that this boy had walked 31 children from the Cotswolds to London through alien-occupied countryside and had not lost a single one of them, he said. "You stay in the building," Casper said. "I'll stay on the roof. Line of sight, radio." Travante said, "If I tell you to go inside, you go inside." Casper said, "Yes." Travant said without arguing. Casper said, "I make no promises about that." Travante almost smiled. He did not quite smile because the situation did not quite warrant smiling yet. But something in his expression shifted slightly, and Casper saw it and looked satisfied. The test was not meant to be a battle. It was meant to be a probe, reconnaissance, a controlled experiment to verify that the device worked as Mitsuki described before anyone made any larger plans based on its existence. Travante had spent a career learning the difference between what was planned and what happened, but he had also spent a career trying to keep that difference as small as possible, and the discipline of preparation was something he believed in deeply, even when the preparation was for something unprecedented. He went out at 4 in the morning, which the task force's accumulated movement data suggested was the low point of alien activity in their sector of London. He moved along the south bank of the Thames, which had become a strange corridor, abandoned vehicles and overturned market stalls, a few slow fires still burning from impacts earlier in the week, the smell of the river and the smell of something else that had no name, something like iron and ozone, and something deeper and more fundamental that Travante associated with the presence of the alien entities, though he had never spoken about this to anyone because it was not the kind of operational data that translated well into a report. In his right hand, the device. In his left, a rifle. In his ear, a radio connected to Casper on the roof of the annex. Casper said at the 40-minute mark, something at 11 o'clock. Far, maybe 800 meters. Trevant stopped. He said, moving toward me? Casper said, not yet. Circling. It does this, Trevante said. How long before it completes the circle and comes this way? Casper said, I don't know. I've never watched a full circle. Maybe 10 minutes? Trevant said, I need it to come to me. A pause. Casper said, why? Trevant said, because 40 meters range means I need it close. And I can't get close to something that's going to sense me coming. It needs to come to me, and I need to be set up and ready. Casper said, what if it doesn't stop? Trevante said, then I move out of the way. Casper said, that's your plan? Move out of the way? Trevante said, I've survived this long on move out of the way, Caspar said quietly. Okay, I'm going to try something. He paused. He said, I think I can push back. I've been thinking about it. The headache goes both ways. It's not just me receiving. I think I can transmit. I've never tried on purpose, but I think I can get its attention. Trevante said, Casper. Casper said, yeah. Trevante said, if this goes wrong, you get off that roof. Casper said, I know. Trevante said, I mean it. Casper said, I know. A silence. Then Casper said, it's turning. It's turning towards you. It's moving towards you. You have maybe 4 minutes. Trevante moved to his position. He had selected it 2 hours earlier on his reconnaissance pass. The alcove under Blackfriars Bridge, a pocket of deep shadow surrounded on 3 sides by solid concrete, with clear line of sight down the riverside path and a retreat route behind him, through the maintenance stairs. He pressed his back against the concrete. He held the device in his right hand with his thumb on the activator. He held the rifle in his left. He waited. He was very good at waiting. He had made waiting into a kind of work, a discipline, the elimination of the part of the brain that counted time, and replaced it with simple, sustained attention. He breathed in a 4-4-4 rhythm that he had been taught in a stress inoculation course in Fort Bragg, and had used in every high-stakes situation since. He did not think about Pierce. He did not think about the 7 people in the North Compound. He did not think about Lyra on the beach in Virginia, waiting for him to come home for the last time in a sequence of last times. He thought about the ground under his feet and the device in his hand, and the 40 meters of river path between himself and whatever was coming, Casper said. Trevante breathed. Casper said, 30, the smell hit first, that iron ozone deep thing, much stronger now, and under it a vibration that was not quite sound, a pressure in his jaw and his teeth. His eyes began to water, Casper said very quietly. 10. Trevante activated the device. The world went sideways, not physically, nothing moved. But Trevante's vision strobed white, and the headache that hit him was like a spike being driven through the back of his skull. And he understood immediately why Casper looked the way he looked, what the dark circles and the constant tension were, because this was that but constant and inescapable, and without the comfort of knowing it would end. Through the white static of his own pain, he saw the entity. He had seen them before, glimpses, at distance, mostly in darkness. But here, at 10 meters, at ground level, with the device screaming between them, he saw it clearly for the first time. It was not what he had expected, which was partly a relief and partly worse in ways he couldn't immediately categorize. It was large, 3 meters tall, roughly, and it moved on 3 limbs in a way that should not have worked biomechanically, but clearly did. Its surface was not quite smooth and not quite textured, like the inside of a mussel shell, this iridescent gray-blue, and it had no face in any configuration he recognized as a face. But it had something at the front of its body that he felt was a sensory organ, a cluster of structures that were currently, he thought confused. It had stopped, not retreating, not advancing. It simply stopped, and it was holding very still. And Trevante thought, this is what disorientation looks like, in something that had never been disoriented before. He did not shoot it. He had the rifle. He could have shot it. He did not know if shooting it would kill it, or merely hurt it, or merely annoy it, and any of those outcomes might make the situation worse. And the purpose of this was not to fight, it was to test. He held his position. The device hummed in his hand, growing hot. The entity turned. Slowly, it turned, not fleeing, not panicking, but reorganizing, reassessing, the way a very intelligent animal reorganizes when confronted with something outside its experience. It took 3 steps back, then 3 more. Then it moved away down the riverside path, not hurrying, but moving with a direction and purpose that suggested it had decided something. Trevante let out a breath. Casper said in his ear, it's moving away. What happened? Trevante said it worked. A silence. Then Casper said, are you okay? Travante's hand was shaking. The headache was subsiding slowly, the way fever subsides reluctantly. He said, yeah, he said, I'm okay. He did not say, I looked it in the face, or where its face should have been, and it looked back. He did not say that the moment it had turned and walked away, he had felt something in his chest that he couldn't name. Not triumph, not relief, something quieter and more complicated. Something that felt like the beginning of understanding, something he was not sure he was ready to understand. He said, come down off the roof. We have work to do. The work, it turned out, was Mitsuki's. The device was proof of concept, but a single device held by a single person was not a strategy. What Mitsuki and Priya and the rest of the engineering contingent built over the following 3 weeks was a network. 41 devices distributed across London, linked to a central control that could activate them in sequence or simultaneously. Not a weapon, still not a weapon. An interference grid, a way to create corridors of disruption through which people could move, through which evacuation routes could be held, through which, eventually, some kind of negotiation of terms might become possible. Because Mitsuki's central conviction, and she held it with the same quiet stubbornness which she held every conviction, which was the stubbornness of someone who had looked at the data and trusted the data over the noise, was that the entities were not here to exterminate humanity. They were here to study it. The ring around the population centers, the specific nature of the impacts. Never into civilian concentrations, always into infrastructure, communication nodes, perimeter positions. The signal she had intercepted from Hoshi 12, which was a study signal, not an attack signal. The way the entity had reorganized and retreated when confronted with something outside its models, rather than escalating. They were scientists, or something equivalent to scientists. They had come here doing what scientists did, learning the parameters of a new environment before, what? Before what came after the study phase. She did not know what came after the study phase. She was trying to figure out how to ask. The task force's linguists. She had come to have complicated feelings about the task force's linguists, who were brilliant people operating in a domain for which no preparation on Earth was adequate, had been working with the reversed Hoshi 12 signal since she had shared it. They had isolated what they believed were structural units, something analogous to grammar, something that indicated the signal carried not just data but relational meaning. They could not yet decode the relational meaning, but they could construct something that they believed would register to the signal receivers as intentional communication rather than noise. They needed to test this too. The question was, tested how and with what? Casper said at one of the task force briefings, I think they can sense me. The room went quiet. Mitsuki, who had been looking at her laptop, looked up. Casper said, when I use the thing I have, the pushing back the way I warned them off in the field, I think they sense it as communication, not words, something more basic, presence, intent. A neurologist named Watts said, can you be more specific? Casper said, no. But I think it's the same mechanism as the signal you've been working on, just organic, biological. I think when the invasion started, it woke something in some people that's related to how they communicate, Jamila said, from her seat beside him. How many other people? Besides you? Casper said. I don't know. I felt other signals, faint ones. There's someone in East Africa, I think. And someone closer, maybe France. It's like hearing a voice from 2 rooms over. Mitsuki was very still. She said, could you amplify it? Casper said, what do you mean? She said. If we built an interface that could take your biological signal and broadcast it at the same frequency as the Hoshi 12 signal, amplified, structured by the linguist's grammar work, could you use it to send an intentional message? Casper said, I don't know. She said, I don't either. But I think it's the best idea I've had in 3 weeks. There was a pause. The unnamed general said, this is a child. Mitsuki said, yes. The general said, you're proposing to use a child as a communications device, Mitsuki said. I'm proposing to use a person with a unique capability in the role that his unique capability fits. If Dr. Watts can confirm there are no medical risks, Watts said, I can confirm no known risks. I can't confirm no unknown risks, the general said. That's not, Travante said from the door. That's enough. He was not part of the decision-making structure of the task force. He had no formal role. He was simply there. And he had a quality that the room had come to associate with him. The quality of being the person who said the thing that needed to be said when no one else was saying it. He said, Casper is right here. You can ask him directly. Everyone looked at Caspar. Caspar said, I want to try it. I've been afraid of this thing in my head for 3 weeks. I want to know if it's actually useful, he said. I want to know if there's a way through this that doesn't end with everyone just shooting at each other until one side runs out of things to shoot. He said this with the flat certainty of someone who had thought about it for a long time and had come to a conclusion that was not going to be changed by other people's opinions. And Travante recognized this and felt something in his chest that was not quite pride but was in the same family. Mitsuki began building the interface. Anisha Malik arrived in London 3 days before Kaspar's transmission attempt. She had not known Kaspar was there. She had not known about any of it. She had known that London was the largest surviving organized settlement in the region, that it had some kind of coordinated infrastructure that had kept the power on and the water running while everything else failed, and that the medical network she had been building along the convoy route, by this point she was coordinating medical care for 4 convoys and had assembled something that was more clinic than triage, with actual supply chains and an intake system, was pointing her toward London as the logical hub. She arrived with 62 people. She had started with 80 and had not lost any since Greta's pneumonia. The attrition had happened in the first week before she had the medical situation organized. To trauma and exposure and 2 cardiac events she had not been able to prevent with the resources available. She had thought about each of them, each of the 18, in the specific way a doctor thought about the cases they did not solve. Not with guilt, because guilt was not useful, but with the disciplined attention of learning, extracting from each case what could be carried forward. Luke carried the alien fragment in his jacket pocket. He had found it on day 4 of the convoy, half buried in a ditch beside the road north of White Plains, a piece of material from an impact site that glowed faintly blue-green in the dark. He had picked it up before Anisha could tell him not to, and something about the way he held it, the way it seemed to pulse slightly in his hand, the way his eyes had changed for a moment, going distant and then coming back, had made her pull him aside and ask if he felt okay. He had said, fine. He had put it in his pocket. She had confiscated it 3 times, and each time he had retrieved it without explanation, and she had eventually decided that forcing the issue was not worth the conflict given everything else she was managing. In London, at the task force facility, a physicist named Chen, who worked in the quantum biology subgroup, took one look at Luke holding the fragment and said, I've been trying to get a sample of this for 2 weeks. Anisha said, what is it? Chen said, we think it's a communication medium, some kind of substrate that carries their signals. We've been finding it at all the impact sites, but it degrades when it's handled with standard equipment. It's been stable in your son's hands for how long? Anisha said 12 days. Chen looked at Luke. He said, would you be willing to let us study it? You can hold on to it. We just want to observe. Luke looked at his mother. She nodded slowly. He said, okay. Chen took them to the quantum biology lab. And that was how Anisha Malik, former suburban doctor, medical coordinator for 4 refugee convoys, met Travante Cole and Mitsuki Yamato and Kaspar Morrow, all of whom had been living at the task force facility for 3 weeks, and who were, that afternoon, preparing for the most important thing any of them had ever attempted. Anisha looked at all of them in the lab. Travante with his burned forearm and his watchfulness, Mitsuki with her headphones and her exhaustion that had become a kind of background radiation she moved through without acknowledging, Kaspar with his dark circles and his careful, quiet competence. And she understood immediately what kind of people they were. She had worked with people like this in emergency rooms. People who had found the calmness on the other side of the panic, not by denying the danger, but by going so far into it that they came out the other side into a stillness that looked like fearlessness, but was actually something more useful than fearlessness. She said, what can I do? Travante said, how are you with field medicine under pressure? She said, that's been my job for 3 weeks. He said, Chen needs a medical monitor on Kaspar during the transmission. Someone who can read the vitals and knows what unusual looks like, and can make a call if something goes wrong. She said yes. It was that simple. She had learned over 3 weeks of convoy medicine that in genuine emergencies, the most useful thing you could say was yes, and then be excellent, and that the people who made emergencies worse were usually the people who needed to process and discuss and qualify before they committed. She had burned that habit out of herself somewhere on the road north of White Plains, standing outside a pharmacy in Millbrook with 3 bottles of amoxicillin in her hands and a woman dying of pneumonia in a car behind her. She said yes. She prepared her monitoring setup. She sat beside Kaspar while Mitsuki ran the final calibrations on the interface. Kaspar said, quietly to no one in particular, has anyone done this before? Mitsuki said no. Kaspar said, great. He said it with a small, exhausted humor that Anisha recognized from residents in emergency rooms. The dark joke as a valve, a release of pressure, the human refusal to be entirely crushed by weight. She checked his pulse. It was elevated but steady. She said, You're doing fine, he said. You can tell that from my pulse? She said, partly. And partly from watching you. He said, what do you see? She said, someone who's decided. She said, that's usually enough. He looked at her for a moment. He said, my mum is in a hospital here. St. Bartholomew's. Travante found out she's still there. She's still. He stopped. Anisha waited. He says, I just wanted someone to know that. In case anything happens. Anisha said, nothing's going to happen. She said it the way she had said nothing is going to happen to patients before difficult procedures. Not as a lie, not as comfort, but as an orientation, a reminder of what they were working toward. She said, and when this is done, we'll take you to see her. Casper looked at her for a moment longer. Then he straightened in his chair. He said, okay. He said, I'm ready. The transmission lasted 11 minutes and 43 seconds. Travante monitored the perimeter. 3 of the interference devices had been activated in a ring around the annex, creating a bubble of disrupted signal that served as both protection and, paradoxically, invitation. A cleared space in the noise, identifiable to anything sensitive enough to notice it. Inside the lab, Caspar sat with the interface connected to him via the sensor pads that Watts had placed at his temples and at the base of his skull, and Mitsuki sat at the broadcast console, and the interface translated Caspar's biological signal through the structured grammar the linguists had constructed and broadcasted on the Hoshi 12. Frequency amplified to a range that the task force's model said should be detectable at the edge of the London Ring. What Caspar sent, or tried to send, he described it afterward as an act of will more than language, as something he had felt rather than said, was something simple, something that felt to him like, we are here, we are aware of you, we are not attacking, we are here, he said afterward. It felt like shouting in a foreign language that you only half know. You can make yourself heard, but you're not sure if what they're hearing is what you're saying. What happened at the 8-minute mark was this. Every alien entity within the London Ring stopped moving simultaneously. The task force's network of motion sensors, deployed across the city over the previous 2 weeks, recorded this in real time, feeding data to screens in the lab that Anisha Mitsuki and the task force watched with the specific kind of silence that preceded either something wonderful or something catastrophic. They stayed still for 4 minutes and 22 seconds. Then one of the perimeter monitoring cameras, a camera pointed east, toward the Hoshi 12 fragment that Luke was holding at the other end of the lab, caught something. A shift in the fragment's glow, from blue-green to a deeper, more saturated blue. Pulsing. 3 pulses. A pause. 3 pulses. Mitsuki said, it's responding, Caspar said, with his eyes closed, very quietly. I know, I can hear it. The linguists clustered around the broadcast console. The physicist Chen put his hands on the fragment case, not touching the fragment, just close to it. Luke held it steady. Travante came in from the perimeter and stood in the doorway. He looked at Caspar. He looked at Mitsuki. He looked at the fragment in Luke's hands, pulsing that deep blue. He looked at Anisha, who was out watching her monitors and whose hands were very still. He said nothing. He stood in the doorway and watched. Afterward, the transmission was analyzed for weeks. What the linguists eventually concluded, and they qualified this heavily, and the qualifications were probably appropriate, but the core conclusion held, was that the response was not hostile. It was not a greeting in any human sense of the word. It was something more like an acknowledgement. Something that, if you translated it through every approximation and caveat and epistemic warning the linguists attached to it, meant roughly, we did not know you could do this. The war did not end that day. Wars did not end in a day, and this one did not either. What ended or began to end was this idea that it was a war. That was the thing that shifted. It shifted in the way that many important things shift, not all at once, not with fanfare, but through the accumulation of small facts that eventually reached a weight that changed the angle of everything. The entities continued to operate within their rings. The task force continued to build devices, to refine the grammar, to develop the interface. Caspar continued to send. Over the following months, Caspar was not the only sender. The others he had felt, the voice in East Africa and the voice in France, made contact with the task force's network. And the network grew, and the transmissions became more frequent and more refined. Travante went home to Virginia. He went home at the 3-month mark, when the situation had stabilized enough that stabilized was the word people were using, and when the satellite phone calls with Lara had moved from flat and careful to something more complicated and warmer and unresolved in ways that were different from before. Unresolved in the ways that meant there was still something to resolve rather than something to close. He drove from Washington to Virginia Beach in a borrowed car in October with the leaves changing, and the sky was normal, just sky. No alien gray film, not since the first week, And he drove with the window down and felt the air on his burned arm and thought about Pierce for the first time since Kandahar, let himself think about it, held the weight of it in his chest for the whole drive and did not put it away. Lyra was at the kitchen window when he pulled up. She watched him get out of the car. He stood on the front walk, and they looked at each other for a long moment. He was thinner than when he'd left. She was thinner, too. He had a scar on his jaw she hadn't seen before. She had cut her hair short. He said, "I'm home." She said, "I can see that." He said, "I'm going to be here." She said, "Are you?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "I am." He said it in the way he had learned to say things that were true, not loudly, not with performance, just as fact, just as the thing that was going to happen. She opened the door. He went inside. Casper went to St. Bartholomew's the morning after the first transmission. Anisha drove him, and Jamila came with him, and they walked through corridors that smelled of hospital and crisis, antiseptic and something under it that was just exhaustion. 2 months of exhaustion worked into the walls, and they found his mother in a ward on the 4th floor. She was awake. She was thin and pale, and there were dark circles under her eyes that matched his exactly. The genetic inheritance of sleeplessness and anxiety, and when she saw him, she put her hand over her mouth, and her eyes went wet. He crossed the ward and sat on the edge of her bed, and she put her arms around him, and he let her, and he did not say anything for a while, and she did not say anything for a while either. Then she said, "You're all right." He said, "Yeah." He said, "I'm all right." She said, "I heard things on the news about a boy who had some kind of ability." He said, "Mum." She said, "Was that you?" He said, "Sort of." She held him a little tighter. She said, "I don't understand any of this." He said, "Me neither, really." He said, "But I think it might be okay." He said, "I think we might figure it out." She said, "You think?" He said, "Yeah." A long pause. She said, "Your certainty is overwhelming." He said, into her shoulder, 90%. She laughed, just a small sound, worn and genuine. The laugh of someone who had been very frightened for a very long time and had just been given, for the first time in a while, something to laugh at. He felt it against his chest and held it there. Mitsuki finished her work on the 2nd-generation interface 6 months after the first transmission. By that point, the interference grid covered not just London, but, through coordination with teams in 11 cities, a significant portion of the Northern Hemisphere's population centers. Not a weapon, never a weapon, a vocabulary. A set of tools for making oneself understood across a gap that was not just linguistic, but biological, technological, and philosophical, across a gap that was, in the most literal sense, cosmic. She worked. She always worked. She opened the door to the room with Kaito's grief in it on a gray November morning, when the work had reached a resting point, and she could not put it off any longer. And she sat in that grief for an entire day, not working, just sitting with it. And at the end of the day, she was not better, but she was different. And different was a beginning. She wrote to his sister. She described his death accurately and without sentimentality and without evasion. And she said, "He was the best person I worked with." She said, "I am sorry I could not do more." She said, "The work we were doing matters." She said, "I believe that." She sent the letter. She went back to work. Luke Malik kept the fragment. Chen had tried to take it a dozen times, and each time the fragment had become inert in Chen Chen's hands and active in Luke's, until Chen concluded that the activation was specific and gave up trying to separate them. The fragment became a fixture of the lab, arriving and departing with Luke on whatever schedule Anisha set, because Anisha had gone from convoy doctor to the facility's head of medical operations and had opinions about her 11-year-old son's working hours. Luke was 13 months younger than Casper. In some ways, he was older. In some ways, younger. He had a different quality in him than Casper, where Casper's gift was directional, a kind of sonar. Luke's was more diffuse, more receptive. He received more than he sent. He said once, sitting in Chen's lab, "It's like they're trying to show me something. Not tell, show." Chen said, "What do they show you?" Luke thought about it. He said, "What it looks like where they come from." He looked at the fragment, which was doing its slow blue pulse. He said, "It's very far." Chen said, "Are you afraid of them?" Luke said, "I was." He said, "I'm less afraid when I understand more." He said, "I think that's true for everyone." Chen wrote that down. The convoys kept coming into London for months, from all directions, from all distances, and they arrived ragged and resourceful and carrying with them the inventory of human endurance. What people had grabbed when they ran, what they had built on the road, what they had decided mattered enough to carry, and what they had put down and left. Anisha processed them through her intake system, which by now was a genuine clinic, which by now had 20 volunteers and 3 other doctors and 2 nurses, and a pharmacist named David who had spent the first 2 weeks of the invasion handing out medication from the back of a delivery van and had arrived in London convinced he had seen the worst and had been entirely wrong. She saw a great deal. She saw people who had lost everyone, and people who had lost no one, and people who had done things on the road that they were not going to talk about, and people who talked about nothing else. She saw the specific toll of sustained fear on the human body, the way it aged people, the way it found the structural weaknesses in a person and pressed on them, the way some people came through it somehow more solid, and some came through it somehow less. She found she could tell, often within the first few minutes of an intake, which was which. She did not talk about Ahmed very much. He was somewhere in the city he had told her he was going to check on that night. He packed the bag that was slightly too large. She had received a text message from him in the second month saying he was alive and was with his sister. She had sent back a text that said, "Children are fine." She had not heard back. The children had not asked her about him recently, and she took this to mean they had arrived at an accommodation with his absence that they would revisit when the time was right, which was perhaps the most human thing about the whole situation. The capacity to table the things you could not handle and come back to them later, carrying them in a pocket like a glowing fragment, waiting for the moment when you had the resources to understand what they were. On the day the first formal contact window opened, the day Mitsuki's second-generation interface, broadcast from 7 synchronized nodes across 3 continents, achieved what the task force classified as a mutual exchange, rather than a one-way transmission. Casper was sitting in a room in the research annex with Jamila and Travante on a video call from Virginia and Anisha next to him and the interface at his temples. He had done this many times now. He was not afraid of it the way he had been at the beginning, when the headache was all there was, and the signal was just pressure and noise, and something alien pressing against the inside of his skull. He had learned the shape of it. He had learned that what felt like intrusion was in fact something more like curiosity, that the entities were no more trying to harm him than he was trying to harm them when he reached back. They were each in their own way, trying to understand. The exchange lasted 47 minutes. Afterward, Casper sat quietly for a long time. Jamila had her notebook out but wasn't writing in it. Anisha checked his vitals. His pulse was elevated. His eyes were very bright. He said, "They've been here before?" "Not here, but here, Earth. They came before a long time ago, before us." He said, "They left something." Jamila said, "What did they leave?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "The same thing that's in Luke's fragment. The same thing that's in me." He looked at Anisha. He looked at his hands. He said, "They seeded it. The capacity. They put it here, and they waited to see what would grow." A long silence. Then he said, "They didn't expect us to grow this fast." Anisha said, "How do they feel about it?" He thought about this. He said, "Surprised." He said, "They feel surprised, mostly." He looked down at his hands again, those ordinary hands with their bitten nails, and the ink stain on the right index, finger from a pen that had leaked in his jacket pocket 3 weeks ago. He said in something else. He said, "I don't have a word for it exactly." He said, "It might be proud." Nobody said anything for a moment. Travante, on the screen, was looking at Caspar with an expression that he usually didn't allow on his face. Open, unguarded, the face of a man who had spent a career preparing to fight things and had arrived somewhere he had not expected to arrive. He said, "How do you feel?" Caspar looked at the screen. He thought about it honestly, the way he thought about things now, without the shortcuts and deflections that had been his habit before all of this. In the before-4 time, when the worst thing in the daily inventory was a school he didn't fit into, and a mother who was sick and a quiet, persistent sense that the world was not quite sized correctly for him. He thought about it for a long moment. He said, "Okay." He said, "I feel okay." Outside the window, the sky above London was gray and ordinary and entirely its own. No alien film, no wrong quality of light. The Thames was doing what the Thames had always done. Somewhere in the city, 31 people who had walked from the Cotswolds were going about lives they were rebuilding from the materials at hand. Mitsuki was at her workstation. Anisha's clinic was full. Luke had the fragment in his pocket. Travante was home. The entities were still in their rings. That would take time. And time was something everyone was learning to work with differently now. Not as something running out, but as something being built. The way you built anything, piece by piece, from the bottom up, with what you had and what you knew, and the people standing next to you. It would not be simple. Nothing that came after would be simple. The exchanges would produce misunderstandings as often as understanding. There would be crises and setbacks and failures of nerve. There would be losses. There would be things that took longer than a human lifetime to resolve, and things that resolved in an afternoon, and left everyone wondering why it had ever seemed impossible. But Caspar Morrow sat in the chair with the interface at his temples, and the signal was open, and on the other end of it was something that had come a very long way, and found something it had not expected to find. A species that had grown into its inheritance faster than anything had a right to grow, that had faced the end of the world it knew and had chosen, over and over, in 10,000 ordinary moments on 1,000 ordinary roads, to understand rather than to simply survive. That choice, that specific human stubbornness, the refusal to stop learning even when learning was terrifying and the teacher was alien, and the subject was the architecture of the universe itself. That was what they had not expected. That was what had always, in the end, been humanity's singular, irreducible thing. The signal hummed. The light outside the window was ordinary and gray and entirely finally its own. Casper breathed in. He reached out. He listened.